Welcome to Around the World with Dane Waters, and I am once again, I haven't changed. I haven't changed my name. I haven't changed anything. Once again, I'm Dane Waters. So Around the World with Dane Waters with me. So I know you keep hoping it's going to be Ben Affleck or Matt Damon or somebody special. Still stuck with me week after week. But luckily, we have great guests. And these guests is what make the show exciting and important and informative and all that good stuff. So before we get to our stellar guest today, let's talk a little bit about world events. Every week we talk about Ukraine. I have to commend the Ukrainians on their actions against the Russians. It's the planning a year and a half of smuggling drones into the country, into Russia to attack their planes and their strategic bombers. It's very, very impressive. What we have to prepare for is what the response by the Russians shall be, and I was talking to some of my Russian friends yesterday, and the reality is, I do believe that this summer is going to be the most devastating part of the war as both sides try to prepare themselves for whatever peace deal, which I have to tell you, I am not optimistic about a peace deal. I just really am not. And probably next week or week after, we'll be talking to some more Ukrainians about that. In addition to that, in Liverpool, there was a terrorist attack. Uh, a guy saying "Free Palestine" took a squeegee bottle filled with kerosene and lit people on fire. It's the second terrorist attack associated with Free Palestine, Free the Palestinians. I think you're going to see more of that as the atrocities there continue. We'll have to see what happens there as well. So those are the two highlights. I mean, there's other things we talk about. We talk about the conservative, the ultra conservative who won the Polish elections yesterday, which was a wild card. He's very sympathetic to the Trump agenda. We'll see, because Poland is a very, very influential and important ally when it comes to the war in Ukraine. We'll see if there'll be any changes or impacts there. And so that's all I have to say for my little monologue here. So I know you guys once again signed on to see the guest, and we have two amazing stellar guests. So let's take a quick break from Around the World with Dane Waters, and we will get started. Thank you. Welcome back to Around the World with Dane Waters. Wait a second, I gotta do this differently. Welcome to Around the World with Dane Waters. I'm your host, Dane Waters. I'm only doing that because my special guest here kind of bribed me to do that, so I apologize in advance for that. But so Stephanie Barello, the world leading economist. Welcome, Stephanie, to the show.
Thanks for having me, Dane. I'm happy to be here.
Well, once again, I have to commend you and say thank you because you are in Utah, I believe. And what time is it there?
Yes,
One
so it
o'clock
is
in the morning?
it's 2 a.m. here right now. But you know what? I had three kids in 3.5 years. The youngest is now 4. So it's only been recently that I've actually slept through the middle of the night. So this is just like old times, waking up and taking care of babies. So just reliving the memories and good times.
Well, I am a baby, so you need to take care of me today. So that works out perfectly. So, just got to keep you in shape. So, well, listen, just so the audience knows, I've known Stephanie and her husband Dan for, I don't know, 15, 20 years or something like that. And I will tell you that they are two of the smartest people I know. So let's get started. So we're talking today. We talk on this show. One of the reasons we have this show is to talk, is to help educate people, which is important because the next segment is about education. So I want our next guest to think that I'm trying to educate. But we talk a lot about trade, and everyone hears about tariffs. But I thought it'd be good for us to talk about, why is that even important? Why should nations care about trade? So let's get down to the basics. So explain to us as a child why trade matters to nations.
That's a great question, Dane, and it's one of my favorite questions to answer. So, in short, specialization and trade are the foundation of economic growth. And if there's one quote that listeners can take away from today, it's that a cooperating group will always have a higher standard of living than a self-sufficient individual or family or nation. And the philosophy that economic growth comes from trade, it's to me, it's borne out by logic. It's borne out by these theoretical economic models that economists come up with, but it's also borne out in the empirical data as well, where indicators show that when nations are more open to trade, that they have higher growth rate in their standard of living or real GDP per capita. So that's the summary, and we can go more in depth.
Well, GDP capital. Okay, well, you're already talking like above my head. I mean, anytime. Once again, I'm from Alabama, Alabama.
Yeah, well, call me
So
out
let's.
if something's going over your head.
Well,
It goes over
I'd be
my head
calling you
half
out.
the time too.
I'd be calling you out constantly. So let's talk about. Okay, if trade is, I agree. Trade is a cornerstone to the economic viability of a nation, right? You have to trade. So the United States trades with people around the world. China trades with people around the world. Nigeria trades with people around the world. But what is a trade imbalance? And is a trade imbalance, even though they're trading, is a trade imbalance a problem for a country?
It all comes down to what your economic philosophy is. Now, most economists today, they look at the balance of trade in terms of not just exports and imports. They're not just looking at goods, but they're also looking at services, and they're also looking at flows of financial capital. So they tend to take a bigger point of view, and so they may not be as concerned about, say, if you are importing more than you're exporting, because there's all these other big macroeconomic relationships that are happening. If your philosophy is that exports are really important as opposed to imports, then that's what you will value. And so, if you want to, we can go in depth about different economic philosophies. And what I think is interesting is right now, some of the ideas that are being discussed about how we think about trade are frankly mercantilist. So, do you want to go in depth on those philosophies? Is that fine?
Okay. Let's talk about mercantilist. It's a word I can't even hardly say. And look, I even said that word, and Jim and I came up and said, "What am I talking about?" Okay, so let me turn Jim and I off here for a second. So,
Yep.
what do you mean by mercantilist?
Okay. Well,
Help
let
me.
me just, oh, that's a great question. So before I'm just gonna, and I teach like an intro economics class. So I'm just gonna go kind of step by step to provide kind of the groundwork. And I think it's important. So what's the economy? The economy is my favorite non-academic definition. It's how we survive on this beautiful and really harsh planet, right? It's how we go about putting a roof over our head and food on the table. Economic growth at its core means that for any given amount of time, we were able to produce more stuff. So instead of us creating stuff with our own two hands, we're utilizing animals and machines, and we have more stuff per hour. Okay, so that's always going to be at the bottom of everything is if you want to have economic growth, what are the things that you can do to make more stuff with a given set of resources or a given amount of time, right? And I think that's important because when you compare the philosophies, you have to compare them to the original standard. How much do they actually increase output per hour or productivity? So some people think that economic growth or comes from like a tradition-based economy where basically you're self-sufficient, you have to produce everything on your own. That is how you survive. And frankly, that's how humanity survived for a long time. And it's how we had to survive. So I'm from the Intermountain West. I know you have a lot of overseas listeners. So this is the part of the United States where we had a lot of cowboys and pioneers and people trekking across the country with their, in their with their wagons and all all their stuff in the wagons. Anyway, so in this part of the country, self-sufficiency is really big because they were on their own in the desert, had to survive. So self-sufficiency is really important here philosophically. Um, but then we will go on. So that's one philosophy is you have to be self-sufficient. The next philosophy is basically where you have the government or some kind of group who decides what should be produced, how it should be produced, and for whom. So, and this can take a lot of different flavors, but basically it's all about, the state and the state making decisions, and also resources going back to the state. So there's kind of, two variations of the, or there's, and obviously this is very simplistic. There's lots of variations of this, but um, forms of this that we have seen in real life are all of the economic experiments of the 20th century when it came to socialism and communism. And obviously, those failed. And that was because when governments were planning how to run the economy, they had problems of information and incentives. And that growth and output per hour, the incentives to be more productive just simply didn't exist. And millions of people, frankly, died because of those experiments. Another kind of slight variation of that is mercantilism. And that's the philosophy that, okay, you have a state or a nation of some kind. You're going to go out and extract resources from somewhere else. So think about colonialism, exploitation, conquest. You're going to send it back to your home country, and then you're going to manufacture goods that then you will then export overseas. And also, you will protect your, and then so the mercantilist class who's funding all of your adventures overseas, their payback is that they get protected from competition from overseas. And so that's kind of at the core of mercantilism. It was like the dominant economic philosophy from the 16th to the 18th centuries, but it's all about the nation, making the nation wealthy and also maximizing exports, minimizing imports, protecting your domestic producers at the expense of competition. And so, what's interesting is this all sounds familiar, right? These are the
Yeah.
ideas that have recently been talked about, um, which is really fascinating because basically, since the economic philosophy that kind of happened after mercantilism was classical economic liberalism, and it was began by, I'm sure you've heard the name Adam Smith, and he published a book in 1776 of all years called The Wealth of Nations. And this book was, it was all the rage on the day. It was such a sensation. But he pointed out, he said, it's not conquest and exploitation that brings economic growth and wealth. And it's not protecting businesses from competition that brings wealth. It's actually specialization and trade. It's cooperation. And the whole philosophy behind that was, okay, if you can focus on a particular task, you can become more productive at it and better at it. You can enjoy economies of scale. You can invent new technologies on it, and then you trade from someone else who has likewise done the same, and you both can mutually benefit when you specialize in trade. So this kind of turns also self-sufficiency on its head as well, because that's the idea that you don't trade with anyone, you do it all yourself. But he said, no, actually, trade is where you can increase your standard of living because you basically get better at the thing that you do. And then you trade with someone else who's also really good at the thing that they do. And so the thing that I always ask my students, or even you, Dane, is, what would your standard of living be like if you had to, no, I know you've actually built homes in the past, so you kind of don't count, but if you had to grow your own food, sew your own clothes, build your own computer and iPhone, build your own home, how do you think your standard of living would be compared to what you enjoy now? And my guess is that your standard of living is a lot higher now because you specialize in something in all of your expertise, and you trade with other people who have likewise specialized in their expertise. So how's that
Wow.
for a run?
Okay. Well, if I'm grading my professor, I'll give you an A plus. Okay, so I will have to
Oh,
go
well,
online and,
well, thanks. I'm sure there's
s-
economists who'd be like, you are wrong on this. Economists love to bicker at each other, so it's
well,
fine.
clearly, I agree. But well, so let's talk about this. So okay, we talked about trade, the importance of trade. We talked about Adam Smith. There's two questions I want to ask here. One is, how important are the people, the quality of the people in a country to be able to trade? That's number one. And number two, how do tariffs work into it? Because the first part, like, okay, let's say this show is broadcasting once again in Nigeria and South Africa and Botswana or Australia. Every country has a different quality workforce. And how important is the workforce to trade?
Right. Well, that's where your different comparative advantages come from, right? Is that because we come from different places and have different skills and experiences, that is absolutely like crucial for trade to occur. I don't know. Is that what you were getting at when you're asking about quality?
Yeah, well, yeah, because when the countries, we hear a lot about brain drain. Countries are losing people every day,
Mm.
and because the best, the brightest are going somewhere else. Now,
Aha, yes.
how does that, when the
Hmm.
best and the brightest leave their country,
Aha.
does that put that country at a disadvantage for trade?
Right. Well, you're asking a great question because one of the things that you need in order for trade and for markets to function well is you have to have good institutions. You have to have, so I like to tell my students this analogy of, when we come together in markets and we trade with each other, you have to have rules of the game, right? It's like imagine playing a basketball game and you have no set rules, right? About what are fouls, how many points are scored and everything. So institutions are the rules of the game when it comes to markets and how you trade with each other. You have to have rule of law. You have to have a dependable legal system because um, you have to have, you have to be able to enforce contracts. Otherwise, what if someone hires you and they just don't pay you, right? You have to have the rules of the game to make sure that the competition is fair. And so in these places where they're experiencing brain drain, I have a hunch that they don't have good institutions to begin with, right? And that they can't really actually compete on a fair playing ground because their government, their economy hasn't set them up to do so. So I would suspect that those places, if they had better institutions, that then they wouldn't feel like burned by all their human capital being drained from their country.
So if you're, if you're a leader of a country watching this show, which I know every leader in the world is watching the show as we speak, and you think about, okay, what can I do, in order to try to make me more competitive in trade, making sure that you keep your people in your country is very important, right? So there should be a focus on ensuring that this brain drain doesn't happen, correct?
I mean, yeah, like that would be something that would be advantageous to them is you don't want to lose your labor force and your skilled labor force. Yeah, because you're losing something that you could compete on and trade on and grow your local economy with. So yes, you're definitely losing on opportunities for your own economic growth for sure.
And what happens to, okay, let me go back to something you said about China. You talked about, the importance of intellectual property laws, good institutions. You said communism and socialism is dead. Okay, so if all of that's true, none of that applies to China. So well, how come China is so powerful?
Well, they are powerful because they have changed their economy. Their economy is far more liberal and market based than it was in the past. And in fact, it's really fascinating when and I'm not like an expert on Chinese economic history by any means, but basically like when you read about some of what they were doing and they were when it came to how they're producing things, there were these small experiments where these communities basically went against the rules and they said, we're going to actually parcel out private property rights instead of just all being communal. And they weren't supposed to do that, but in doing so, they actually were way more productive. And then so the Chinese Communist government saw, oh, this is actually a good idea. So then over time, over the last several decades, they've actually loosened up a lot. Now, that being said, they are they are not a free market economy and it's not capitalist. And so yes, they've had a great success story, but it's because they have gone in the direction of classic, economic liberalism.
Okay, so let's go into this whole thing about tariffs. I mean, I know you're
Yes.
not a tariff expert, but if we talk about trade imbalances and we talk about the importance of trade and how do tariffs, what is the philosophy behind a tariff?
Okay, so a tariff is a tax on a foreign good that's imported into your country. And so, just like any tax, it leads to a higher price for your consumer. It leads to a lower price received by the company, the producer that's selling it. And it leads for the economy to be smaller than what it otherwise would be because taxes are distortionary. That's just what they do. Um, and
Okay, wait.
tariffs
The distortion, help me down. Distortionary. I can't even
Distortionary
say the word.
meaning that the economy would be larger otherwise
Okay.
than in the absence of taxes. And you could see that with any kind of tax, right? Not just a tariff. Um, and obviously, governments have tariffs because they want to protect their domestic industries and they want to raise revenue. The downside to that is that when the government is doing so, they essentially are picking winners and losers because they're picking, okay, which industries do we want to protect? But then they're penalizing the companies that then use those imports in their supply chain. So, for example, the US auto industry, even when you see a car that is made in America, 25% of that car is made from parts imported from overseas. So when you put on a tariff, You're not just helping your, domestic producers, but you're actually penalizing companies who use those imports in their supply chain. And then also tariffs can be really, I think and I hear this all the time from people, and they ask me because I ask local business people, how are tariffs impacting you? And I talk to all sorts of people and ask them, and people tell me, well, don't tariffs help American jobs per se? But the problem is you have to do the math. Okay, so for example, in the first Trump administration, they put tariffs on washing machines, and the idea was to save the local, GE, whatever, those jobs that are making washing machines and dryers. And so what happened is economists estimate that those tariffs, they led to a 12% increase in prices, but it created 1,800 jobs in the United States. Now, if you do the math on what the impact was of that price increase relative to the number of jobs that were increased, the estimates are that each job created cost $800,000. And the question is that the best
Wow.
way to go about protecting your domestic industry is to have that huge cost on consumers? Is that the right way to even think about economic growth? Because, like I said, economic growth is all about increasing output per hour. It's ultimately about innovation. And are you going to be stuck looking at, okay, I'm going to protect these manufacturing jobs, or are you going to focus on what's going to bring economic growth in the future? And also, people may blame jobs lost on trade, but they are less likely to blame lost jobs on, say, new technology, right? And so think about how many jobs have shifted because of new technologies, right? So in the United States, people used to be farmers. Now it's less than 2% of the population because we've become way more productive. But as a result, that didn't mean that everybody lost their jobs. It means that there's now new industries and new economic opportunities and products that have been created, which have been incredible. So it just all depends on where your mindset is, on what you want to do to grow the economy in your country.
And so we only have 2 minutes here left. So let's talk about in the current tariff wars or trade war, who are the winners and losers right now?
Everyone's a loser. In my
Oh,
personal philosophy.
okay.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the tariff wars, I mean, that being said, you're gonna have those 1,800 jobs in some facility
Yeah,
somewhere, and
well,
that means a lot to those people. But in terms of geopolitical relationships, or in terms of those companies who use those imports in their products, or the consumers who are buying stuff, we know that obviously we've experienced a lot of inflation in the United States, so that's pressuring those families as well with higher costs. So to me, the tariff wars and especially the uncertainty, it negatively impacts everyone. Businesses who are also planning, if they don't know if they're going to have a price increase, are they going to invest in a new facility, create new jobs? The uncertainty is not good for American businesses or consumers on net. So, and it's not good also for our relations with countries overseas.
well, I'm really depressed now. No, I don't know what to say. But anyway, but let's okay, so it is a closing remark. If you could give to seriously to like the leaders around the world who are listening, if you could give them one piece of economic advice right now in the global context, what would it be?
I'll just circle around to where I started. A cooperating group of people will always have a higher standard of living. And I think if that's, obviously we know that there's nuances and like all of these, topics have gray areas and nuances, but if that's your overall philosophy that when we cooperate and we trade together, that we are better off, I think that's the best mindset to have that can help create economic growth and prosperity for humanity.
Well, I hope you're right. I mean, I think we should cooperate because otherwise, I think we're in a world we're heading in a direction where our borders are closing and there's a lack of cooperation and sides are being drawn and it's hard for there to be economic growth in the current political reality. So I agree with you
Right. The standard
100%.
of living will decrease. It will go down or not grow as fast
Well,
as it would have otherwise.
well, tell Dan I'm coming to live on your sofa here pretty soon. So,
Okay, please come.
I'll come. I, anyway, Stephanie, thank you
There's
very much
always
for
room for Dane
the
here.
time. See, world, hear that? There's always room for Dane in Utah.
Always,
So,
always, yeah.
always, I appreciate that. Well, anyway, thanks, Stephanie. I appreciate it. And I'll talk to you soon. Anyway, let's take a quick break from Around the World with Dane Waters, and we'll be back with our next guest. Thank you.